As I recall it, it was about daylight when we halted and made coffee. I remember this very distinctly because I did not get any of the coffee, having dropped down under a tree and fallen asleep, holding the rein of my horse, and I did not awaken until called to fall into line. We did not unsaddle at this halt, so the animals secured but little rest. This was on the fateful morning of June 25th, when so much was destined to happen. We all knew that we were on a hot Indian trail and likely to run into the savages at any moment. Excitement began to grow, and every move was watched with curiosity and intense eagerness. Throughout the morning, we were traveling quite rapidly. Toward noon, there was a halt, and General Custer called his officers together and gave them their instructions. It so happened that my company, M, under Captain Thomas French, Company A under Captain Moylan, and Company G under Captain Wallace were elected to go under the command of Major Marcus A. Reno. Of course, we did not know at that time what General Custer's plans were or how many companies he took with him, but later learned that companies C, E, I, F, and L were under his immediate command, and Captain Bantine was given companies H, K, and D, while Company B was to guard the pack train under the command of Captain McDougal. As I recall it, it was Bantine and his command which started on to the left. General Custer and his command went straight ahead along the little tributary of the Little Bighorn River, but on the right bank of the stream, while Reno and his command marched parallel to Custer on the left bank. Soon after this, Adjutant Cook came direct to Reno from Custer with some instructions. Then we took a rather sharp angle to the left, and things began to liven up. We were then trotting our horses and going down a long hillside which took us to the Little Bighorn River, which we crossed. I believe it was Company M which headed the advance and was the first to ford the river. Company A followed, with G Company in the rear. Soon commenced the rattle of rifle fire, and bullets began to whistle about us. I remember that I ducked my head and tried to dodge bullets which I could hear whizzing through the air. This was my first experience under fire. I know that for a time I was frightened, and far more so when I got my first glimpse of the Indians riding about in all directions, firing at us and yelling and whooping like incarnate fiends, all seemingly as naked as the day they were born, and painted from head to toe in the most hideous manner imaginable. We were soon across the stream, through a strip of timber, and out into the open, where our captain ordered us to dismount and prepare to fight on foot. Number 4s were ordered to hold the horses, while numbers 1, 2, and 3 started for the firing line. Our horses were scenting danger before we dismounted, and several at this point became unmanageable and started straight for the open among the Indians, carrying their helpless riders with them. One of the boys, a young fellow named Smith of Boston, we never saw again, either dead or alive. In forming the firing line, we deployed to the left. By this time, the Indians were coming in closer and in increasing numbers, circling about and raising such a dust that a great many of them had a chance to get in our rear under cover of it, where we found them on our retreat. It was on this line that I saw the first one of my own company comrades fall. This was Sergeant O'Hara. Then I observed another, and yet another. Strange to say, I had recovered from my first fright and had no further thought of fear, although conscious that I was in great peril and standing a mighty good chance of never getting out of it alive. The Indians were now increasing in such hordes and pouring such a hot fire into our small command that it was getting to be a decidedly unhealthy neighborhood for Reno's command. In a short time, word came to retreat back to the horses in the timber. We got back there about as quickly as we knew how in this excitement. Some of the horse holders released their animals before the riders arrived, and consequently, they were placed afoot, which made it exceedingly critical for them. It was said that before Reno gave the order to mount and retreat, he rode up to Captain French and shouted, "Well, Tom, what do you think of this?" Captain French replied, "I think we had better get out of here." Reno thereupon gave the order, although I did not hear it. Neither did I hear any bugle calls or other orders or commands of any sort. I could hear nothing but the continual roar of Indian rifles and the sharp, resonant bang-bang of cavalry carbines, mingled with the whoops of the savages and the shouts of my comrades. When I got to my horse, there were not many of us left in that timber that I could see. Soon after, Private Henry Coltsbooker, who was striker for Captain French, was shot through the stomach, just as he was in the act of mounting his horse. He fell to the ground, and I saw Private Francis Neely dismount to help him. I thereupon got off my own horse and helped Neely drag the wounded trooper into a clump of heavy underbrush, where we thought he might not be found by the Indians. William E. Morris, another comrade, came up at this juncture and helped us care for Coltsbooker. We saw that he was probably mortally wounded, so we left him a canteen of water and hurriedly mounted again, dashing toward the river in the wake of our flying trooper comrades. After the battle, we found the body of Coltsbooker where we had dragged him. He was not mutilated and consequently had not been discovered by the Indians or their squaws in their fiendish work of killing and mutilating our comrades who had been helplessly wounded in the river bottom. I cannot say that the retreat from the river bottom and further on had a very military appearance, but I can say that I saw nothing disorderly about it, although so many had gone on ahead of me and were so far in advance that what they did or in what order they retreated, I really cannot say with positive certainty. I didn't strike the river at the regular ford, so I was compelled to jump my horse into the stream at a point where the bank was about 6 or 8 feet high. My animal nearly lost his footing when he struck the water. As I glanced about me, the first thing that engaged my attention was Trumpeter Henry Fisher of M Troop, riding in the river some distance up, with Lieutenant Benny Hodgson hanging to one stirrup. Hodgson had been wounded and was on foot in the stream when Fisher came dashing into the water. Noting Hodgson's helpless condition, he thrust one of his stirrups toward him, which Hodgson grasped and was thus towed across to the opposite bank under a galling fire from the Indians, who were now riding into the stream, shooting into the ranks of the stampeding troopers, and actually pulling many of them from their horses right there in the river. As Fisher gained the opposite bank, dragging Hodgson at the end of his stirrup, and the latter was trying to struggle up the incline, another shot rang out and Hodgson dropped. I did not see him move again and supposed he was killed right there. My own position was decidedly precarious. As I urged my horse through the water, I could see Indians in swarms about the ford above me, and many lashing their ponies to reach that spot, paying no attention to me. One reason for this was that I was alone, and they were doubtless looking for bigger game. Bullets were cutting the air all about me. However, as there were Indians on both banks, as well as in the water, fighting hand to hand with the troopers, death seemed to ride on every hand, and yet a kind providence must have been watching over me, for I crossed the stream unscathed. It was at the ford crossing where many of the men met their death, but in the retreat to the river and the climb up the steep bluffs on the opposite side, some 29 troopers were killed. I believe one reason why so many of the men escaped was because of the intense dust which was raised by the horses and ponies of the combatants. It hung in dense clouds and was almost impossible to see 50 feet ahead in any direction. With fully 2,500 or 3,000 Indians racing their ponies about through that dust-laden plain, one can understand better the explanation of the situation. After getting across the river, I had the steep bluffs to climb. Now, these were so very abrupt that many of the already wearied horses were unable to carry their riders to the top, and many of the men had to dismount and lead their exhausted animals, all the time being under a murderous fire from the Indians hidden in the brush along the river. On the way up, I passed the body of Dr. D. Wolfe, one of our surgeons, who had been shot and killed while trying to gain the top. I arrived at the crest of the hill without even a scratch. here I came upon Captain French with about 20 of the men, and I joined them. Captain French was as cool as a cucumber throughout the entire battle, and although I searched his face carefully for any sign of fear, it was not there. He had such perfect self-control that I had to admire his courage and bravery, and was indeed glad to be under his leadership. I was, however, considerably worried about the rest of the command and where Custer was, and why he had failed to support us as he had promised to do. It looked to me as if we would be wiped out before any assistance arrived, as the Indians were now swarming up the bluffs after us, seeking places of advantage where they could completely surround us. It was not long before Captain Benteen was seen coming our way. I didn't know where he had been or what he had been doing with his 3 companies, but I do know that they did not show the wear and tear of the Reno remains. Had Reno not made that move out of the river bottom when he did, just in the nick of time, we could all have fared the fate of Custer and his men without any assistance from anyone. Even yet, I cannot understand why Benteen was not at hand where he could have assisted Reno in the fight in the river bottom. Of course he had his orders, but what they were, I don't know. But after he joined us on the hill, we shortly thereafter all mounted and started in the direction that Custer was supposed to have gone. But we didn't get very far. The Sioux had such a countless horde of warriors there, and they met our advance with such a staggering fire that we were compelled to turn about and retreat to our first position on the hill. Even here, we were not in a protected position. There were higher ridges than the one we were on, and they were occupied by Indian sharpshooters who poured heavy volleys down upon us. However, we were in the best position we were able to get in the limited time at hand. Here we laid out a hospital with the horses staked around the outside. We then formed in line of battle outside the horses, and the fighting commenced with renewed vigor on both sides. We were ordered to lie flat on our stomachs and stay down and not to expose ourselves, for the least sight of any portion of the body was the signal for a volley from the Indians. It was not long before we were carrying more wounded men to this improvised hospital. There were many redskins on the higher hills which our short-barreled carbines could not reach. Finally, our first sergeant joined the line at this point. He carried a special make of rifle, his own private weapon, and with it he was enabled to throw bullets into the midst of the Indians there, and he soon silenced their fire. While in this line, Captain French was about in the center, giving orders as coolly as though it was a Sunday school picnic. He would sit up tailor style, while bullets were coming from the front and both sides. I could but marvel that he was not hit. Without appearing to be in the least excited, he would extract shells from guns in which cartridges would stick and pass them loaded, then fix another, all the time watching in every direction. We were not very well entrenched, as I recall, that I used my butcher knife to cut the earth loose and throw a mound of it in front of me upon which to rest my carbine. At one time, a bullet struck the corner of this mound, throwing so much dirt into my eyes that I could scarcely see for an hour or more. That same afternoon, while lying face down on the ground, a bullet tore off the heel of my left boot as effectually as though it had been sawed off. That was as close as the Indians ever got to me, but I saw many of my comrades who fared much worse. With all the sad happenings in that hellhole, there were yet some amusing incidents. In my company was a young fellow known as Happy Jack because of his jovial disposition. During all that leaden hail that fell about us, I could hear Happy's hearty laugh ring out at a distance, although I couldn't imagine the cause of it, as I really didn't see anything to laugh at. But it cheered me, and it did make me feel a bit braver. Another time, I was helping drag a wounded comrade into the hospital. We were compelled to drag him because we dared not expose ourselves. On the way back, we started to walk out from the hospital site instead of creeping out. My comrade had just reached the horse line when a bullet struck him behind the ear. Fortunately, it was merely a glancing shot passing through his ear. He tumbled to the ground and rolled over and over until I had a chance to examine him and assure him that he was not seriously hurt. I had only just returned to my position on the firing line when the man next to me was shot through the shoulder and disabled. The firing was very heavy all through the afternoon of the 25th and continued until dusk, which was about 9 o'clock in that region at that time of year. After that, we had a little respite and took occasion to strengthen our defenses and make better breastworks. At peep of day on the 26th, the fighting again commenced with renewed vigor. Just about daylight, a stray pack animal, with the pack yet on its back, wandered past our line, and in order to relieve the poor beast of its burden, 2 troopers and myself arose to our feet. Having done some packing, I was quite handy in untying the ropes, but we had only just started when some Indians caught sight of us and gave us a volley. A stray shot cut off the corner of a hardtack box in the pack. We managed to get the pack loose, but did nothing more, getting back to our places or the line as quickly as possible. These were the first shots fired on the morning of the 26th, which was another busy day all around for both troopers and Indians. We had been kept awake the night before by Major Reno and other officers who walked about among us to see that none were asleep. It was a hard task to refrain from dropping off after the excitement of the previous day, but we had little chance to relax. When the ball opened on the 26th, Dr. Porter, who was the only surviving surgeon of the entire command, came up and said that the wounded were crying for water and ought to have it. Volunteers were called for to venture to the river. This was extremely hazardous, as the Indians were occupying the brush along the opposite bank of the stream and commanded every approach to the water. I did not go out with the first detachment sent for this purpose, but I did with the second. We had to creep cautiously down the hill through a coulee until we arrived at its mouth, where it debouched into the river. It was about 30 feet from the mouth of the coulee, and we had to cover this 30 feet entirely exposed to Indian bullets at short range, fill the canteens or camp kettles from the stream, and go back again under fire. When the first squad went out, nobody had the forethought to post a bunch of good shots at a point where they could be firing volleys into the brush to silence the fire of the Indians, but when my detachment went for water, several expert riflemen were instructed to fire volleys into the brush while we were getting the water and running back into the coulee. In spite of this, an Indian managed to still put a hole through the camp kettle that I carried, so that I lost a good amount of the water. However, after several attempts, we managed to fill all the vessels and get back to the hospital, where it is needless to say that the water was a godsend. I've read in Captain Godfrey's account of these water volunteers that all the men were rewarded with medals of honor by Congress. I never received any such medal, nor do I think any other man did. If so, I never heard of it. In our venture to the stream, we found Trooper Mike Madden lying in the coulee, shot through the ankle. Mike was a big husky fellow and had accompanied the first detachment. He lost his leg in the hospital where it was amputated. An amusing incident happened in connection with it. Before amputating the member, the surgeon gave Mike a stiff horn of brandy to brace him up. Mike went through the ordeal without a whimper and was then given another drink. Smacking his lips in appreciation, he whispered to the surgeon, "Doctor, cut off me other leg." Later on, Mike was employed in the harness depot of the Department of St. Paul. I had made the trip for water with a young comrade named Jim Weeks. On our way back, Jim was hailed by Captain Moylan, requesting a drink. I was surprised to hear Jim blurt out, "You can go and get your own water. This is for the wounded." Nothing more was said, but I know that must have been a hard pill for Moylan to swallow. After carrying the water to the hospital, we returned to our places on the firing line. I had just laid down when the man on my left, Henry Rutten, was shot through the shoulder. And thus it went for the balance of the day, with Captain French still sitting up tailor style, superintending the firing and defying the Indian bullets without flinching once. I was no longer frightened, in spite of the fact that there seemed no chance of our getting out alive, surrounded as we were by thousands of Indians far better armed than ourselves, and outnumbered 100 to 1. I must say that I had to admire Major Reno during the entire fighting on the hill. I also saw him twice in the river bottom, and he didn't seem to be at all ruffled. To a man in such a responsible position, it must have been a trying time, without the support in sight which Custer had promised him. Our ammunition had been nearly exhausted during the fighting in the bottom, and had we not retreated to the hill, we certainly would have been wiped out in a very few minutes. I observed Reno several times during the fighting on the bluffs, and can well remember his walking about among the men through the night. He would tap a man with his boot and remark, "Don't go to sleep, boys." I cannot understand why he was not shot down while walking about, as none of the troopers were able to make a move without drawing the fire of the Indians. I know it encouraged his fellow officers as well as the troopers. I've read articles pertaining to this part of the Battle of the Little Bighorn in which it was stated that Reno was drunk. This I brand as a lie. At no time did I observe the least indication of drunkenness on the man, nor see him use any liquor. At dusk that evening of the 26th, the Indians had withdrawn to such an extent that we were enabled to lead our poor, famished horses down to the water. I couldn't locate my own, so I grabbed another, a fine black animal which I later learned belonged to Captain Weir. After this, I heard no more firing, but we kept our places in line throughout the night. The next morning, we had roll call of the company, and many were missing. Through the kindness of John Ryan, who was first sergeant of my company, I have a copy of that roll call as the dead and missing were marked off. Later, we observed an immense dust cloud coming our way up the valley. Some remarked that it was the Indians coming back, but we soon received word that it was General Terry's command. It must have been an awful shock to him, as he was to meet Custer that very 27th of June so they could attack the Indian village together. When he arrived at our position, he told us, with tears in his eyes, what he had seen of the Custer command. It did not seem possible. This was the first intimation we had as to Custer's fate. It was an awful blow to us, as every man lost friends who were in the companies commanded by Custer. Nobody ever dreamed that he could possibly meet with such an overwhelming defeat. William C. Slapper of the 7th Cavalry.